In today's video, we're going to talk about how to set macros for cutting like a world-class bodybuilder. We're going to go through the 4 steps for setting them. Then we're going to talk about a couple of work examples just so you have an idea of the numbers. Then we'll talk about how you test them to see if those macros are working for you. And finally, what the typical process of adjusting them down looks like as a contest prep continues. Okay, in today's video, we're talking about setting macros for cutting. It's a 4-step process, and this is based on the evidence-based recommendations of natural bodybuilders. So some world-class research put together by Eric Helms, Alan Aragon, and Peter Fitchen. And what I'm going to try and do is just give you a really simple summary of how the best natural bodybuilders in the world set up macros, how they test them, and then how they adjust them as a contest preparation goes on. Now, you probably won't go to the full extent of getting every gram right as a natural bodybuilder would do within kind of 5-gram ranges. But just understanding this process can be super, super useful. Now, I've kind of used a bit of a consulting graph from an old business graph to simplify this idea. This is a waterfall chart, and basically what you do is you set up the calorie constraint, then you set your protein, then your fat, and then your carbs. This is how the world's best natural bodybuilders set their macros, and we're just making it a little bit simpler by putting it into a graph. So the thing that you begin with is how many calories you have. You start up with what your maintenance is, your total daily energy expenditure, and you need to work out how many of those calories are, and then you can subtract 20% to set up your deficit. So this is, you take away 20%, and that is going to create the energy deficit that will begin your fat loss phase. Now, this is actually very, very tricky. You can go on an online calculator to try and work out what your maintenance is, or you can use a multiplier like 14, 15, 16 calories per pound of body weight, but they are not very accurate. The best way to do it is to track what you're eating for a couple of weeks, and then to set your, and then check while your body weight is stable. So if you track what you're eating and you find out that your body weight is stable for 2-3 weeks, eating 3,000 calories a day, you have a decent idea that is your maintenance. Now, people who are really serious about this stuff will have been tracking their macros for a good month before they start a preparation. And that is the right way to do it, because calorie calculators are in no way accurate. They use activity multipliers that really are a bit of a thumb suck. So if you're not going to be tracking them before you set your macros, just bear in mind that it's a bit of a guess, and then you'll have to adjust them. But this isn't the biggest problem in the world, because everybody adjusts their macros anyway. So you set your calories minus 20%. So if you've got a maintenance of 4,000 calories a day or 3,500 calories a day, take your 20% away, that'll give you 2,800 calories. If your maintenance is 3,000 calories, take your 20% away, that'll give you 2,400. And if your maintenance is 2,500 calories, take 20% away, that will give you 2,000 calories a day to begin with. And those are kind of rough ideas. So a guy with high energy expenditure can start cutting at 2,800. A guy with more typical energy expenditure can start cutting at 2,400. And a guy with more, low energy needs, he's down at 2,000. So that's your calorie budget. And then next up, you set protein. Protein is set, very, very simple terms, 1 gram per pound of body weight. So if you weigh 200 pounds, you set your protein at 200. The general range is 0.8 to 1.4. People who are leaner and really going for it in a contest prep tend to set their protein a bit higher. But for more normal people, you can actually afford to set your protein a fair bit lower, so 0.8, 0.7. And the real kind of barometer of whether you're going to keep your muscle mass is how much you're lifting rather than your protein intake. So having a massively high protein intake isn't going to help you much unless you're doing a lot of resistance training, to make use of that protein. Once you've set your protein, then it's your fat. Fat, you can set it about 0.3 grams per pound of body weight. So for your 200 pounds, you will get 60 grams of fat. You could set it a bit higher, all the way up to 0.5. So that would be 100 grams, or right down to 0.2, which would be 40 grams. So that's very low fat to start out. Generally, people try to set their fat a little bit higher to begin with, and that gives them some room to adjust as they go on. And then finally, you have your carb intake, and that's just basically whatever is left over. So you take your total calories, and then you take away the calories associated with the protein and the fat. So 4 times the grams of protein, 9 times the grams of fat, and that will give your remainder of your carb intake. Okay, now I'm just going to quickly do two worked examples. So I'm going to do it based on a 200-pound man and a 150-pound woman, just so we can run some numbers, because really, the calculations are actually very easy. The problem is working out your maintenance to begin with, and then actually hitting your macros as opposed to kind of being miles off. So for the 200-pound man, I'm going to assume that they have a maintenance around 3,000 calories, which is pretty typical. So we set the 20% deficit. That is going to give us 2,400 calories to play with. So from our 200 pounds, we're going to use 1 gram per pound body weight. So that is very easy for protein. So we've got 200p for protein. And then we're going to use 0.3 grams per pound for fat. So that's 200 pounds times 0.3 is 60 grams of fat. And then what we do is we take these away from the 2,400. So 2,400 minus 200 times 4, so minus 800 is 1,600. And then 60 times 9 is 540. Away from 1,600 is 1060. So then we need to divide 1060 by 4 is 250, 260, about 260, 265. I'll just call it 260. I think it's 265. 260 carbs. So those are your macros. 200 protein, 60 fat, 260 carbs. Now, when you're looking at that, that's pretty classic bodybuilder style, which is they tend to protect their carbohydrates and lower their fat because they like to do lots of lifting and they like to have their carbohydrates high. But there are many people who would prefer to have more fat for fullness or just for hormones or whatever. So you could easily, at 260 grams of carbs, that's plenty carbs, you could easily shift some of those carbs into your fat. So you could take, I don't know, 60, 70, 80 grams of those carbs, and then push your fat back up towards 80 grams or something. That's a perfectly natural thing to do. Okay, so now we're quickly going to do our female example. I'm going to assume she weighs 150 pounds and that her maintenance calories are about 2,000 calories. And that may be a little bit low, but, I just got to make the calculations easy to do them mentally. So 2,000 calories, apply the 20% deficit. 20% less than 2,000 calories is 1,600 calories, and we are off to the races. So 150 pounds, we'll go with 1 gram per pound of body weight. That's 150 grams of protein. Women have less lean mass than men, and protein really should be set around your lean mass. So it could be the case that 150 is a little bit high, maybe do better at 140, 130, even 120. So, but you could alter that. For fat intake, 150, we'll just go with the generic 0.3 again, so that's 45 fat. And then whatever's left over. So 1,600 minus 4 times 150. So 4 times 150 is 600. So that gets us down to 1,000 calories. So we're down to here. And then 45 fat times 9 is about 405. So we take that away. We're down to 600 calories. And then divide the 600 calories by 4 will give us 150 carbs. And those are her macros. 150 protein, 45 fat, 150 carbs. And you just look at that, like I said, and you go, protein's probably a bit high, so protein could come down a touch. Fat could go up a touch. Starting a prep at 45 is pretty low fat. You might want to, take a few carbs or a few protein and nudge the fat up to 50, 55, 60 grams. But that's it. That is basically it. And this is where you get the big bit of freedom. So obviously you can be really aggressive with your protein if you're doing a lot of lifting, but most of us don't need as much protein as the higher end of bodybuilders will set it. They simply, they're trying to be safe and they know that protein is very satiating and there's the thermic effect of food. A lot of it is burnt off. So they tend to set protein very high. I would just generally say for a general person, you don't need protein that high, particularly if you're not lifting enough. So basically, the main thing that's going to keep muscle mass on your body is doing tons and tons of lifting. And if you're not training very hard, you just don't need protein that high. But in terms of freedom, the fat v carb piece, that is very individual. So some people are just going to feel better, they'll have more energy, and they'll be able to control their hunger on higher carbs, whereas other people, they'll find they feel a bit flat if their carbs are too high, and they do better on higher fat. And that bit there is the really individual bit of what is going on. Alrighty, now let's talk about testing your macros. As I said at the start, finding out what your maintenance is very, very challenging. calorie calculus use these activity multipliers that are in no way accurate. They're based on how much exercise you do, when in fact, you know, it's down to your genetics, your posture control, how much you fidget. Your activity level is really, really complex. And on top of that, your energy needs change. So if your maintenance starts out at 3,000 calories, once you've lost 10, 15, 20 pounds, your maintenance could have dropped to 2,500 calories. And your maintenance kind of moves around in that plus or minus 500 calorie zone. So if you go on a big old bulk and you're overeating consistently, your maintenance could go up 500 calories. Whereas if you diet really, really hard, your maintenance could drop by 500 calories. And working out where you need to be is the real challenge. In terms of what is working, macros that are working, if your macros are delivering you between 0.5 and 1% of body weight loss per week, then they are bang on. Ideally, you want to start out closer to 1% of body weight per week, and then as the cut moves on, you'll have to tolerate slower weight loss. For women, you tend to, you know, losing 1% of body weight per week is really incredibly good going for a woman. You tend to need to accept a little bit slower fat loss. And that's just how it is. Generally, just take the averages of your weight throughout the week. Ignore the first week of data, because that's generally a lot of water weight loss. And then between weeks kind of 2 and 5, so you get 4 weeks of data, and you look at it and you're like, I'm losing 0.8% of my body weight per week, and that's just perfect. Just stay there. If you're losing less than 0.5, you want to make a cut. So you can cut out 200 calories in the forms of 50 grams of carbs, or 25 grams of carbs and 10 grams of fat, something like that. Or if your calories are already pretty low and you don't want to drop them anymore, you can just add in some cardio. So you could add, 3 times 500 calories on a machine, or 3 times 300 calories on a machine, or just neat. You could add more steps, and that is it. And basically, you just adjust your way, test how your macros are going, and then just adjust them down. And that is how it works. And this is what I'll talk about now. So last up, we'll just talk about adjusting. Basically, people's macros change over the course of a preparation, of a cut, and they can really drop down significantly, because basically your energy needs decline, not just because you're getting lighter, but also because you've got hormonal, your fat cells are sending hormonal signals to your brain, your stomach's sending hormonal signals, and your brain is managing your energy status, and it will downgrade your energy expenditure. So what typically would happen for your average guy, I would say his cut starts up at about 2,400 calories, and as he gets really lean, he ends up way down at kind of 1,800 calories. For a typical woman, I would say it's more kind of 1,700 down towards 1,300, but they're just the mid-range. You know, a high-energy guy could start at 3,000 and finish up at 2,400. It's incredible, right? But a guy with low energy needs might start at 2,000, and he will end up digging all the way down at 1,600, 1,500. I'm just going to throw up some numbers now. These are the lowest stages from bodybuilders in the 3D Muscle Journey group. This is one of the world's best coaching groups for natural bodybuilding, and you can see the variation is simply massive. But what you notice is that protein is pretty high, fat is pretty low, and all the variation comes out of carbs, because basically if you've got lots of energy to play with, you can afford lots and lots of carbs. And I would say just generally these athletes tend to be the top end of their athletes, and they tend to do better on higher carbs and lower fat. And more general population people, that may not be the case. They may need to go slightly higher in their fat. But just the general idea is that the variation is massive, and over the course of a cut, your calories may drop down by a good 500 calories, and that is just the way it is. I hope you enjoyed that. You do not need to track your macros perfectly to the gram to understand and benefit from this stuff. Just simply the idea that you need to be pretty kind of consistent, and then check how your results are going and make an adjustment. And consistency is the absolute key, because at the end of the day, it is impossible to be completely accurate with your macros, because, the macronutrient content of different foods actually varies considerably, and each gram of carbs is not equal to each gram of carbs technically, because of the types of food. So what you're really using these macros for is just to be very consistent and then make an adjustment. Very consistent and make an adjustment. And if you can be consistent and patient, then you can get absolutely ripped to shreds. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, make sure you subscribe. And if you know your macros, chuck your numbers in the comments below. I would love to see what you are doing. Make sure you throw in your weight and height as well, because that's always interesting. Thanks so much. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you jump on the email list and get our 5 simple strategies to start losing weight cheat sheet.